And welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Moser's 8th grade U.S. History class. Today we're going to be looking at the Bill of Rights, the Amendments 1 and 2. Let's get started. The textbook readings for this particular video lecture comes from Chapter 6, Section 2, the Bill of Rights, pages 216 to 221. The guiding questions today are, what are the Bill of Rights? What is majority rule? Why is it important to protect the rights of everyone? What are your rights under the First Amendment? What are your rights under the Second Amendment? Why is there a difference of opinion on the Second Amendment? So the Bill of Rights are a set of rules that defines the rights of the people. The Bill of Rights became the first 10 amendments to the American Constitution. Remember when we talked about the ratification of the Constitution? The biggest concern of the anti-federalists were that there were no specific protections to the American people, which is one of the reasons why they were trying to block that ratification of the Constitution. In a compromise, the Federalists agreed that one of the very first things that the new Congress would do would put together a list of rights. These first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution becomes known as our Bill of Rights and are some of the most protected rights we have as American citizens. The Constitution totally has 27 amendments, 27 changes to it. However, the first 10 are just known as the Bill of Rights. So why have a Bill of Rights? Well, an important idea in our democracy is this idea of majority rules, right? We have elections, and those elections have consequences, and people that get elected as our representatives will pass laws, and those laws will have an impact on our daily life. But because we have this idea of democracy where the majority decides these issues, many Americans were very fearful that without some kind of specific protections of the minority, their rights could be taken away from. And that's what the Bill of Rights tries to do. It acts like a shield to protect the average citizen from having their rights trampled upon. So that's the Bill of Rights. It's this 10 first changes to the Constitution, this idea that that we need to have some protections from government. What do we as citizens have protections of? So let's look here at our First Amendment. Amendment 1 basically reads as follows: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. What this basically means is that we as Americans have the following protections. We have freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, and freedom to petition. Our First Amendment is some of our most cherished protections we have as American citizens. The first one being the protection of religion. The government cannot establish a national religion, and it cannot prohibit people from exercising their religious beliefs. So we have this freedom of religion. We are also guaranteed freedom of speech. We are protected from the right to have petition, to protest against the government. Our press is also protected under the freedom of the press. And we have a right to peacefully assemble to protest any actions that we feel is not appropriate that our government is undergoing. So our First Amendment has really a large list of these rights, but religion, speech, press, to assemble and protest and petition are all cherished rights as listed in the First Amendment. So how does that pertain to you as students? Let me tell you a story about a student named Mary Beth Tinker. Let's see here. Mary Beth Tinker, age 13, was getting dressed for school one December morning in 1965 in Des Moines, Iowa. Besides her winter clothes, she wore a strip of black cloth about 2 inches wide around her upper left arm over her sleeve. Like a growing number of American students, Mary Beth passionately opposed the current Vietnam involvement in the Vietnam War. She wore the black armband as a symbolic statement of protest, a way to mourn the dead on both sides of the war. So did her brother John, age 15, and their friend Christopher Eckhart, age 16. Their feelings against the war ran deep, and all day long their kids and teachers would know it. Unfortunately, Mary Beth had barely gotten to algebra class when she was sent to the office. A few days earlier, concerned over student protests, the school board had banned armbands as a disruptive influence. Mary Beth, John, and Chris had worn the armbands anyway. Now they were suspended from school, furious as well as frustrated at what they saw as unfairness. To them, the wearing of armbands seemed like a form of free speech as protected by the First Amendment. With their parents' help, they sued the school board, and their case ended up all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a triumphant moment for students. In Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District, the Supreme Court decided in the students' favor. The court ruled that students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate, meaning children are people too. The verdict held that the First Amendment protects the rights of public school students to express their political and social views. It was a controversial decision, to be sure. Mary Beth Tinker received death threats, and her house was vandalized by those who thought she was being unpatriotic. But her name is now in just about every book about constitutional law. She grew up to become a nurse at a children's hospital and still considers herself an advocate for children's rights, which she believes should extend to safe living conditions, health care, and good education. Her brother John became a computer programmer and is still active in political protest, and her friend Chris has worked for many years on behalf of children as a counselor and supervisor in a child support enforcement. So, was Mary Beth Tinker's rights violated under the First Amendment? The Supreme Court ruled in Tinker versus Des Moines it did, in fact, violate Mary Beth Tinker's rights to freedom of speech. However, since Mary Beth Tinker, there have been other Supreme Court cases that have put some restrictions on student free speech. What I mean by this is that schools do have a right to regulate student speech if it is a disruption to the learning environment or the contrary or goes against the message of the school's anti-gun, anti-violence, anti-drug message. This is why we have a dress code, and that can be enforced, which doesn't necessarily violate students' freedom of speech. So the First Amendment is a protection that you do have this idea of freedom of speech. The Second Amendment deals with the following. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So what does this basically mean? It guarantees citizens' right to bear arms and form a militia. In essence, this is talking about the right to bear arms, the right for gun ownership. Now, this amendment has some different viewpoints surrounding it. There is a more broad view of the Second Amendment, which says that you can't stop criminals from getting guns, and lawful citizens under the Second Amendment have a right to protect themselves. And an unarmed population could be very easily enslaved by the government, and therefore people also need to have guns to protect themselves from an unlawful government. This is the more broad view, which a lot of those who oppose gun regulations typically support. Those who support gun regulations typically have more of a narrow view of the Second Amendment, where the amendment only specifically mentions militias, which are like our National Guard. Those were the volunteer armies back in the Revolutionary War days, and doesn't necessarily specifically mention individuals. However, there have been recent court decisions that have said there is an individual right implied in the Second Amendment. There are too many victims of gun-related crimes, and so there is a need to regulate guns to keep our streets and our cities safe, and that's why there should be more regulations of guns. And laws need to be passed to help stop gun violence and gun crimes. So the Second Amendment definitely does have some different views in regards to how people view this amendment and how it's applied. So those are the first two amendments as listed under the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment, which is their guarantee of speech, religion, and the freedom of the press, and the right to assemble and protest. And then the Second Amendment, which deals with the right to bear arms. Thank you for listening. As always, if you have questions, make sure you come talk to your teacher.